This is actually my first lecture about my book, and it's a pleasure to have it here at Stockton, and it's also an opportunity to thank everyone here at Stockton of really warm and supportive welcome. Very, very happy to be here, and I hope you find today's lecture, it's about the book, but it's also a bit about what I'm doing now. So I hope you find it interesting, and really looking forward to hearing questions, criticism, objections, and so forth. So my book deals with the history of one region in the first half of the 20th century, the Carpathian region to be precise, or a large part of it. This is the part of the Carpathian region that I'm dealing with. Romania here, Poland here, Hungary, Slovakia. And through this region, I deal more broadly with the history of Hungary in the first half of the 20th century. But my analysis and current research project extend beyond Hungary, and I hope shed light on the history of Southeast Europe more broadly, particularly the multi-ethnic and multi-religious borderlands in the first half of the 20th century. And this is a map of Central and Eastern Europe during the war, and this is my focus mostly in my current work, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria during the war. And I use this map because it kind of highlights my interests, mostly Hungary and Bulgaria, but Romania as well. I argue in essence that if we locate the events and processes of exclusion, persecution, mass deportations, other forms of mass violence, and mass murder of Jews in Southeast Europe during World War II, within the histories of Southeast Europe during the first half of the 20th century, and this is a rather conventional move on the part of historians that we simply usually just call contextualization. The result of this is a historical picture with insights that challenge, I argue, a number of basic and very general concepts in Holocaust scholarship and education, which have become almost axiomatic. Among them, anti-Semitism, which is a basic concept, and what stands at the center of my lecture today, bystanders. What I suggest then is, in effect, to discard some of the vocabulary that may blur more than clarify the diverse set of events and processes that together, and significantly only in hindsight, we call the Holocaust. At the center of the narrative of the Holocaust that I would like to suggest is the process of imperial collapse and the rise of nation-states in Southeast Europe, from the slow and terribly violent demise of the Ottoman Empire beginning in the late 19th century until the shattering of the European land empires after World War I, especially for our geographic focus, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So here in blue is Austro-Hungary since 1867, and the Hungarian part of Austro-Hungary in the Imperial world. The drive to create territorially expanded states on the rubbles of these empires, each with as little minority populations as possible, played a crucial role in shaping policies and states of mind across Southeast Europe in the first half of the 20th century, and arguably until the present, including policies that targeted Jews in those states for discrimination, persecution, and mass violence before and during World War II. One of the nation states that emerged from the ruins of the imperial order in Southeast Europe was Hungary. And this is just to give you a sense, this is the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and here you could see what remained of Hungary after World War I. The end of World War I and the Trianon Treaty in 1920, which took from Hungary 2/3 of its pre-war territories and 3/5 of its population, set the stage for the emergence of a revisionist consensus in Hungary and the longing to establish a greater Hungary with a marked ethnic Hungarian Magyar majority. This vision entailed a multi-layer attack against non-Magyars, Jews, and others under Hungarian rule during World War II, first and foremost in the multi-ethnic and multi-religious borderlands that Hungary occupied from Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia between 1938 and 1941. So again, just to emphasize, this is the pre-World War I Greater Hungary. This is the extent of its loss. And if to focus just on Hungary, these are the borderlands that Hungary lost after World War I, and these were the multi-ethnic and multi-religious borderlands that it sought to occupy during World War II and to help establish with this occupation of the borderlands the Greater Hungary. Subcarpathian Rus was situated in the northeastern corner of the Hungarian kingdom within the Austro-Hungarian Empire until World War I. Part of the Eastern Front moved back and forth in the region, and fighting went on until 1920 between Romanian, Hungarian, and Czech forces. Eventually, the territory became the easternmost part of the new state of Czechoslovakia. And here we see Subcarpathian Rus. Step here. And then in two stages in November 1938 and March 1939, the Hungarian army occupied the region and crushed what was in those few months an autonomous entity called Carpathian Ukraine. Another occupying force came in March 1944 as the German army, the Wehrmacht, strolled into Hungary, barely firing a single shot. Finally, after the Hungarian authorities and German occupiers joined hands enthusiastically in ghettoizing and deporting the region's Jews to Auschwitz in April, May, and June 1944, the Soviet army took the area in October 1944. Within less than a year, in the summer of 1945, it turned into a part of Soviet Ukraine. Ivan Olbrecht, a Czech writer, quite well known in the 1930s, spent much of his time during the 1930s in Subcarpathian Rus, and he described the relations between Jews and Carpathian Ruthenians, the majority population, in his novel Nicola the Outlaw. And I quote, "Through centuries of association, the Jews and Carpathian Ruthenians have become used to each other's peculiarities, and religious hatred is foreign to them. They see into each other's ritualistic mysteries and religious sorcery, just as they see into each other's kitchens and rooms. But beware of casting a new idea in their midst, for then at once two types of mind and nervous system will reveal themselves." This quote may help us think about Jews and notions of belonging in modern Europe, turning our attention to the delicate dialectics of intimacies that pierce holes in communal boundaries through which one can see the other, quote unquote, in her or his physical and spiritual setting. This may bring to mind French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas's idea of the response to and responsibility towards the other that we should feel immediately upon seeing her or his face. And we might think of the relevance of this plea today when our screens are full of other children, approximately half of the 65 million refugees around the world. Yet neither this sense of responsibility nor the worlds of the villages and towns in Subcarpathian Rus suggest some kind of ideal state of affairs or the collapse of all distinctions. Indeed, differences, two types of mind and nervous system, existed and could even assume sharper edges. The point, however, is that the elements of routine coexistence within a frame of separate group spheres created a society and culture that was larger than the sum of its parts. And this included, alongside Jews and Carpathian Ruthenians, ethnic Hungarians, again, Magyars, Roma, local Germans known as Carpathendeutschen, some Slovaks in the western part of the region, and some Romanians in its eastern reaches. Thus, we cannot really talk about Jews or any of the other groups in the regions and the culture of Subcarpathian Rus simply because they constituted an integral part of that world. So we can't speak about them separately. That's what I mean. Jews and the local culture, they were an integral part of that world. Still, the Holocaust has rendered it particularly difficult to imagine and discuss Jews as rooted, that is, natives, in the societies in which they once lived. My regional case study highlights the problematic nature of the ongoing tendency to think of Jews as a world almost completely apart from other groups. Yet some of the most established concepts that frame the analysis of the persecution and destruction of Jews and Jewish communities in World War II reflect the force of this paradigm that, in effect, viewed Jews in isolation, surrounded by populations that much scholarship still describes with recourse to words like anti-Semitism, collaboration, and, again, the topic of this lecture, bystanders. One obvious problem with this separatist approach to the study of the histories of Jews is that it simply ignores essential contexts. Events and processes in the lives of Jews almost always occurred in relation to events and processes that happened to non-Jews. To be sure, there were significant differences between the experiences of Jews and those of their neighbors during World War II, but there was also much that linked them. This is an important point that is related to the way we imagine, think about, and write history more generally through national narratives. These collective stories about our quote-unquote group tend, in principle, to relegate others to the margins. Inclusive approaches, by contrast, do not just aim to capture a larger part of the picture, they tell a different kind of story. Projects of state and nation building in Subcarpathian Rus, which may be Albrecht's new ideas, have sought, in essence, to destroy or significantly alter the culture of Subcarpathian Rus as a whole. The ultimate aim was to destroy difference as an organizing principle of society and render it impossible to imagine again a multi-ethnic and multi-religious social fabric. If we think about this history only in as much as it concerned Jews, we miss this larger picture, and ultimately we understand less what happened to Jews and how Jews responded. Returning to the dynamics of Jews and Carpathian Ruthenians, we see that Albrecht made no mention of violence that may result from antagonisms becoming more pronounced between these groups. This may surprise us at first, if only because of the powerful hold on both public and scholarly imagination of images of communal violence against Jews during World War II. We might then think that we have encountered an exception. Yet, in other multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual border territories of wartime Hungary, we're talking about, for example, northern Transylvania or the southern areas, the Delvedek. In these other territories, Jews also suffered the violent demise of their worlds and lives with barely any violence by their neighbors. We also know of no anti-Jewish communal violence in any scale in the borderlands of wartime Bulgaria, to take another example from Southeast Europe, where Bulgarian authorities destroyed the Jewish communities and deported Jews to German hands in March 1943. This raises questions about social crisis through which the social fabric disintegrates without extreme violence between neighbors. When many people see and hear state-organized violence without taking part in the carnage. What characterizes the responses of these people, the somewhat elusive bystanders? Looking at the case of Hungary, one methodological problem becomes clear. We think about the Holocaust in Hungary primarily and often almost only by reference to the rapid ghettoization and deportation to Auschwitz that occurred after the German invasion of the country in March 1944, when Carpathian Ruthenians and others indeed stood by and in many cases watched the process of annihilation and the suffering of their Jewish neighbors. This periodization, however, detaches the events and processes after March 1944 from the history of the state of Hungary during World War II before March 1944 and places the post-March 1944 period within the narrative of the German final solution, quote-unquote. Now, to be sure, this is in itself not wrong. It is, however, only part of the story, and it also fixes our analytical gaze on the other Hungarian part in a way that we actually look at it backwards in time, in this case through Auschwitz, beginning in Auschwitz, rather than, as we should at least try, by tracing the forward-moving dynamics and the meaning of history as it unfolded. Right? So there's a basic methodological problem here that we're beginning from the end, actually, which is our privilege because we know what happened, right? But people who lived in Hungary during World War II did not know what happened. The suggestion I advance here then is to think about bystanders historically in the most basic ways, with attention to the twists and turns of events and processes as they happened, what again we otherwise refer to with a rather dry word, context. Beyond the general importance of this comment for the study of Hungary during World War II and the violent end of Jewish life throughout the country, with the partial exception of the capital Budapest, an in-depth exploration of the wartime context reveal multiple layers of violence between 1938 and 1945, in some cases against non-Jews, and in some cases when Jews actually found themselves in the position of bystanders. While we talk much about the analytical inadequacy of the divisions made by the famous Holocaust historian Raoul Hilberg of perpetrators, victims, and bystanders, we rarely discuss Jews during the Holocaust beyond the times and places in which they were either victims or engaged in resistance. I posit that looking at Jews as bystanders provides us with the opportunity not only to appreciate hitherto unnoticed complexities in the history we address, but also, and more broadly, to gain new insights on the experiences of this form of behavior, bystanding. So let's venture in more detail into this history. The sources on Jews' lives in Subcarpathian Rus show no traces of any significant anti-Jewish discourse among Carpathian Ruthenians prior to the 1920s and 1930s. Accounts of Jews confirm this, and let me quote a few. Yeger Ezra, born in 1927 in Vilki Böchkov, for instance, remembered that, and I quote, "Most of our neighbors were not Jews. We lived very much in peace with them. We really lived a good life with the non-Jewish neighbors. We played soccer with the non-Jewish kids. Together we went to school. At the time, we did not feel so much our Judaism, that we are Jews and they are Goyim, that is non-Jews, except during Shabbat." This Jewish Shabbat. End of quote. This may seem like a strange and perhaps extreme statement. Yet Samuel Muller, to take another example, born in 1912 in Alsho-Kalinfalva, depicted relations between Jews and non-Jews with exactly the same words as he explained the atmosphere that characterized the relationship between the two Hasidic groups in his small town. Quote, "No hard feelings." Adding later that, quote, "We, Jews and non-Jews, mixed, and we lived together," end of quote. And Naftali Deutsch, from yet another town, Vilki Komyat, clarified that, quote, "There was no Jewish quarter. In terms of lifestyle, occupation, and appearances, Jews differed little from the non-Jews amongst whom they lived," end of quote. As the numerous and diverse accounts of Jews that I have read in the last few years show, such situations obtained across the region. Prague's control of the region between 1920 and 1938 changed this. Constructs that define Jews and Carpathian Ruthenians as part of ethno-national collectives rather than in relation to a specific location or religious faith bred conflict and brought an end to the shared lives of Jews and Carpathian Ruthenians. But national activists and movements alone provide no explanation without the context that made them a dominant factor in these intergroup dynamics. It was the stance of the Czechoslovak government with regard to the region that determined the collective notions that became attached to the new ways in which growing numbers of Carpathian Ruthenians began to ponder their place in the world beyond their villages and small towns, right? The slow infiltration of nationalism. That Prague refused to grant autonomy to the region and to its Carpathian Ruthenian majority population in contradiction to its commitment after World War I. So Czechoslovakia actually could take control of the region because it committed to give this region autonomy, the region and the Carpathian Ruthenian majority, as part of the post-World War I treaties, and that Jews nevertheless chose to support the new rulers after World War I, mostly by sending their children to Czech rather than Carpathian Ruthenian schools, proved decisive. So Jews thus seemed to serve as agents of quote-unquote Czechization and obstructors of Carpatho-Ruthenian collective aspirations. This sense of betrayal and the belief that the behavior of Jews siding with a hostile state kept Carpatho-Ruthenians in a subordinated social political status facilitated the rise of anti-Jewish resentments. This political experience of Carpatho-Ruthenians in Czechoslovakia drew, therefore, on common perceptions of deprivation and injustice. This reality of anti-Jewish resentments, and I emphasize resentments, challenges the obscure and all-encompassing way in which we usually use the term anti-Semitism, as we see, in this case, a specific emotion that frames a specific interaction in a specific context, without an age-old hatred of Jews. Indeed, rather than the common use of the term anti-Semitism as the main or even sole reason to persecute and kill Jews during World War II and in other periods, and its explicit or implicit association with hatred, I ask, what kind of positions and emotions constitute anti-Semitism in this case? What made them operational at specific junctures, and what kind of actions did they prescribe? Prague eventually granted the region and Carpatho-Ruthenians a limited measure of autonomy at the end of 1938 in order to quell internal unrest and focus on the growing threat of Nazi Germany that had just, in October 1938, occupied a strip of land, the so-called Sudetenland, on the western border of Czechoslovakia. The hectic period of autonomous Carpatho-Ukraine intensified the rift between Jews and Carpatho-Ruthenians and saw the only instance in the history of the region in which Carpatho-Ruthenians engaged in anti-Jewish violence. It remained sporadic, however, despite the prodding of foreign Ukrainian nationalists who played dominant roles in the attacks, and these foreign Ukrainian nationalists crossed from the Carpathian from eastern Galicia. Another external force, the Hungarian army, put an end to this short-lived violence by destroying Carpatho-Ukraine in March 1939, as Hungary joined Nazi Germany in crushing Czechoslovakia. The invading Hungarian army pursued Carpatho-Ruthenian militiamen who put up resistance, in some cases targeting non-combatants and leaving thousands dead within several days. Jews witnessed Hungarian soldiers killing Carpatho-Ruthenians. Rabbi Yoshua Grünwald of Hust, for example, wrote shortly after the war that, quote, Hungarian soldiers killed numerous Ukrainians. He used Ukrainians to talk about Carpatho-Ruthenians in this case. In her memoir written 40 years later, Aranka Segal described bodies of Carpatho-Ruthenians combatants which she saw floating in the river that ran through her small village, where Naftali Deutsch, who I quoted from him, also lived. Aaron Rutt from Veliki Bichkev, Yeger Ezra's town, related the incarceration of local militiamen in a school in his town, where, quote, every night for several days they would take some of them out and kill them in the forest, end of quote. And Eva Shlomovitz remembered that, quote, they killed them. The Hungarians killed these young boys, the militiamen, a lot of them, end of quote. Eva Shlomovitz's description is particularly revealing. She repeats her statement about the killing 3 times, one after the other, each with a bit more information: the identity of the perpetrators, the youth of the victims, and the scale of the attack. It is as if she wished to disrupt her flow of words, perhaps remain with the anonymity of the first part of the sentence, they killed them. But I suggest that some degree of disbelief, even as she recounted this episode after many years, pushed her to restate the mass killing, unprecedented in her life until then, that she had witnessed in her hometown. Right? This was the first time, of course, that she had ever witnessed such an event, and it was the first time that such an event had taken place in her town. It was Saul Friedlander, eminent historian of the Holocaust, who evoked the disbelief of Jews as victims in the face of persecution and mass murder during the Holocaust. they could not fathom the abyss that many of them felt had suddenly opened to devour their worlds. Seeking to place this acute alienation at the center of his narrative, Friedlander asked his readers to retain, quote, a sense of disbelief with regard to the ways in which this case of genocide happened. That is, to mistrust any explanation in order to remain on the pre-knowledge level of experience, where, to quote Friedlander again, disbelief is a quasi-visceral reaction, one that occurs before knowledge rushes in to smoother it, end of quote. A critical engagement with this proposition extends well beyond the confines of this paper. What is important to stress here is that Eva Shlomowitz's disbelief relates to the position not of the victim, but that of the bystander. Her disbelief stemmed from the violence she had seen, no doubt, but also, I argue, as a response to its broader meaning, the rupture of her familiar world, a clearly ominous indicator that life could never return to normal if, to paraphrase her, they could kill them. And if they, the Hungarian occupiers, could kill them, Carpathian Ruthenians who lived, and here remember, quote, who lived mixed with Jews, so much so that the former could see into the latter's homes and vice versa, see others who seemed very much like them, so the attack destroyed not only them, but also the whole set of daily interactions that defined normality. In short, it laid a blow on a way of life of both Carpathian Ruthenians, victims in this case, and Jews, bystanders in this case. Thus, Friedlander's evocation of completely unexpected and unprecedented violence that begets disbelief opens an unexpected window onto the destabilizing experience of the bystanders, the disruption that recasts the routine possibilities and constraints in society. Jews in Carpathian Ukraine in mid-March 1939 found themselves in a position in which helping the victims seemed to them impossible, and rightly so. Many of them also saw the violence, in some sense at least, as contributing to their own to end their own persecution at the hands of those who now had quickly lost their power. Right? Because this was autonomous stage was the first time where there was a bit of anti-Jewish violence, and the Hungarian invasion in effect stopped this violence. We could then identify here some measure of agency, disrupted and very limited, that still remained within those hectic days. Moments of intense disruption, however, pass, but the seeds of devastation all too often remain. Under Hungarian occupation, both Jews and Carpathian Ruthenians became victims of the state's drive to realize the ethno-national vision of Greater Hungary, albeit to varying degrees and in different ways. And while cooperation across ethnic lines remained scanty, Carpathian Ruthenians largely shunned contact with the occupiers and played no role, certainly no collaborating role, in the anti-Jewish persecution and violence. By early 1944, social breakdown had reached a nadir, so that in the spring and summer of 1944, when now Carpathian Ruthenians became bystanders to the ghettoization and mass deportations of Jews, only faint traces remained of the willingness to see and be seen that Albrecht had noticed a mere decade before this total act of destruction. Indeed, Carpathian Ruthenians who stayed behind closed curtains in their homes during the deportations, as many Jews remembered in their testimonies, clearly chose not to see. But those on the streets who looked on as Hungarian gendarmes violently expelled Jews from their towns, and whom many survivors described as well, gathered to watch a cruel spectacle of public humiliation that stood in contrast to the acknowledgement and the act of seeing in Albrecht's story. Like Jews in 1939, Carpathian Ruthenians in 1944 exhibited a disrupted and limited sense of agency. The image of Jews as facilitators of quote-unquote Czechoslovakia still alive in their minds, while they stood by as Hungarian occupiers with only a few Nazis around, violently ended Jewish life in Subcarpathian Rus. To conclude, if we think about Carpathian Ruthenian bystanders in 1944, without placing them within the appropriate historical process from the 1920s and 1930s, we risk falling into the regrettably still common accusatory and moralizing tone concerning bystanders in much Holocaust scholarship. This tendency to judge rather than to understand brushes aside complexities by viewing history backwards from 1944 in our example, rather than as it unfolded from 1939, and by imposing on it a Western liberal notion of choice and agency that in no way fits the perception of most Europeans at the time, Jews and others, that their societies and worlds had been irrevocably shattered and that their lives and the places where they lived had changed drastically and forever. It is precisely this largely successful obliteration of the society and shared culture of pre-World War II Subcarpathian Rus that renders the narrow focus on Jews and the use of such general and disembedded concepts as bystanders analytically obstructive. It is, to put it simply, time that we treat the genocide of Jews during World War II as an integral part of the history of modern world. Thank you.